Friedrich Nietzsche died in 1900, his mind shattered in the attic of his sister's house in Weimar. Lee Kuan Yew was born in 1923 in colonial Singapore, a Chinese boy who would become, in Henry Kissinger's words, the greatest strategic thinker of our age. The German philosopher never set foot in Asia. The Singaporean statesman was trained in British law at Cambridge. Nietzsche despised nationalism and the petty politics of his era. Lee built one of history's most successful nation-states. Nietzsche celebrated the individual who transcends the herd. Lee subordinated individual liberties to collective survival. And yet, and here is our paradox, to read Lee Kuan Yew through Nietzsche is to suddenly see both figures in sharper relief. Their apparent contradictions dissolve into a deeper unity. Both were diagnosticians of decadence. Both rejected the moral sentimentalism of their respective eras. Both believed that greatness requires the courage to create new values. Both understood that life is will to power, and that those who deny this truth become its victims rather than its masters. Tonight, I invite you on an intellectual journey. We will explore how the concepts Nietzsche forged in his Alpine solitude found their most remarkable embodiment not in Europe, but in a tropical city-state that had no business surviving, much less thriving. We will see how Lee Kuan Yew, probably without ever reading Zarathustra, became a living refutation of everything Nietzsche despised and a vindication of everything he celebrated. God is dead, Nietzsche proclaimed in 1882. He did not mean this as a statement of atheistic triumph, but as a diagnosis of crisis. The metaphysical scaffolding that had supported Western civilization, the belief in transcendent purpose, objective morality, and cosmic justice, had collapsed. Europe faced a void. The question was not whether to believe in God, but what values would fill the space left by his departure. Now consider Singapore in August 1965. The Federation of Malaysia had just expelled this tiny island. Lee Kuan Yew wept on television, a rare public display of emotion from a man who would later boast of his Machiavellian preference for being feared over being loved. For me, he said, it is a moment of anguish. All my life, my whole adult life, I believed in merger and unity. Singapore in 1965 faced a Nietzschean crisis in concentrated form. The colonial god, British imperial authority, had departed. The Malaysian god, the dream of a multiracial federation, had rejected them. What remained was a swamp-ridden island of 580 square kilometers with no natural resources, no military, no hinterland, surrounded by hostile neighbors, riven by ethnic tensions, and dependent on British bases that were scheduled to close. How do you make a living? Lee asked in those desperate days. There is no brick, no timber, no raw materials. What do we have? The answer he discovered was profoundly Nietzschean. We have ourselves. We have will. We have the capacity to create values where none existed before. Singapore would not appeal to tradition. It had little worth preserving. It would not appeal to ideology. Lee had seen how Marxism ravaged economies. It would not appeal to religion. Singapore was multiracial and multi-faith. Instead, Singapore would create itself from nothing, an act of pure will, an experiment in what Nietzsche called the transvaluation of all values. This is the first and most fundamental Nietzschean insight in Lee's career, the recognition that when old values collapse, new values must be created, not discovered, not inherited, created, and creation requires creators, individuals strong enough to shoulder the burden of meaning-making without the comfort of divine sanction or historical precedent. Let us speak plainly about Nietzsche's most misunderstood concept. The will to power is not a prescription for domination. It is a description of what life is. All living things, Nietzsche observed, strive not merely to survive, but to grow, expand, overcome resistance, and impose their form on the world. The acorn wills itself into an oak. The artist wills their vision onto canvas. The philosopher wills new concepts into being. Lee Kuan Yew understood this instinctively. Consider his remarkable statement. If you can't force or are unwilling to force your people to follow you with or without threats, you are not a leader. Western liberals recoil at such language, but Nietzsche would recognize it immediately as an honest acknowledgement of what leadership actually requires: the capacity to impose order, direction, and purpose on human beings who would otherwise drift into entropy. The will to power manifested in Lee's governance at every level. Where other post-colonial leaders wallowed in victimhood, Lee demanded excellence. "We didn't have the luxury of failure," he explained. "Singapore had to succeed. We would have starved if we failed." This was not rhetoric, it was biological reality. A city-state without resources survives only through superior organization, superior discipline, superior will. Consider what Lee actually did. He took a fractious, multilingual, multicultural population, Chinese, Malay, Indian, Eurasian, and forged them into a single nation through sheer administrative will. He made English the language of government and commerce, knowing that no ethnic group would accept another's language as supreme. He imposed compulsory military service, knowing that shared suffering creates shared identity. He built public housing that deliberately mixed ethnic groups, breaking up traditional enclaves that might ferment separatism. "We decide what is right," Lee declared, "never mind what the people think." This is the will to power in its political dimension, the refusal to defer to majority opinion when majority opinion would lead to disaster. Lee banned chewing gum because it fouled public transport. He executed drug traffickers because soft penalties had failed elsewhere. He sued journalists because he believed a small nation could not afford the luxury of adversarial press relations. Each decision was an assertion of will against the entropic pull of disorder. Nietzsche wrote that life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, overpowering of the strange and weaker. Lee might have said it more diplomatically, but his entire career demonstrated the same insight. A small, weak nation surrounded by larger powers could survive only through relentless self-strengthening, through becoming harder, smarter, more disciplined than its competitors. Singapore would be the hawk in a world of lambs. Nietzsche's transvaluation of all values was not destruction for destruction's sake. It was clearing the ground for new construction. The old Christian bourgeois morality, he believed, had become life-denying, weak, decadent. What was needed was a new morality that affirmed strength, creativity, and the fullness of earthly existence. Lee Kuan Yew performed precisely this operation on Singapore. Consider what he rejected: the Western liberal assumption that individual rights trump collective welfare, the socialist assumption that the state should guarantee outcomes rather than opportunities, the traditional Asian assumption that family connections should determine advancement. In place of these inherited moralities, Lee constructed something new, a system of values centered on meritocracy, pragmatism, and survival. "We are pragmatists. We don't stick to any ideology. Does it work? Let's try it. And if it does work, fine, let's continue it. If it doesn't work, toss it out, try another one. We are not enamored with any ideology." This pragmatism was itself a value, indeed, the supreme value. It was Nietzsche's will to truth stripped of metaphysical pretension. Lee did not ask whether a policy was right in some abstract moral sense. He asked whether it worked. Did public caning reduce crime? Yes. Then continue it, regardless of what human rights organizations said. Did allowing casinos boost tourism revenue without destroying social fabric? The evidence suggested yes, then permit them, despite earlier objections. Lee's second great value was meritocracy, but meritocracy understood in a very specific way, not equality of outcome, which Lee dismissed as fantasy, not even equality of opportunity, which he thought somewhat naive, rather meritocracy as the systematic identification and cultivation of talent. "I started off believing all men were equal," Lee confessed late in life. "I now know that's the most unlikely thing ever to have been." From this unsentimental recognition came Singapore's ruthless educational sorting, its aggressive recruitment of global talent, and its lavish compensation for government service. Nietzsche would have recognized this as an attempt to cultivate what he called higher types, not through breeding programs, as some of his more sinister interpreters suggested, but through institutional design that rewards excellence rather than mediocrity. Lee was explicit about this goal. A society to be successful must maintain a balance between nurturing excellence and encouraging the average to improve. The third pillar of Lee's new morality was what he called Asian values, a concept much criticized but worth examining seriously. Lee argued that communitarianism, respect for authority, and the subordination of individual desire to family and social harmony were genuine cultural goods, not merely vestiges of backwardness to be discarded on the path to Western modernity. The individual, in this view, was not the autonomous atom of liberal theory, but a node in a web of relationships and obligations. Here we see Lee diverging from Nietzsche, or perhaps extending him in an unexpected direction. Nietzsche celebrated the individual who breaks free from the herd. Lee built a herd so well organized that it could compete with any individual. The tension is real, but perhaps resolvable. What Lee created was not a herd of last men content with comfort and security, but a herd trained for struggle, a nation that understood itself as perpetually at risk, that could never afford complacency. Singapore's conformism was not the soft conformism Nietzsche despised, but the hard discipline of an army perpetually at war. Nietzsche's distinction between master morality and slave morality is perhaps his most controversial contribution to ethics. Master morality, as he described it, affirms strength, nobility, and the right of the excellent to rule. Slave morality, born of resentment, inverts these values. It calls strength evil and weakness good, celebrates pity over pride, and seeks to bring the powerful down rather than to elevate the lowly. Lee Kuan Yew was a master moralist in a world increasingly dominated by slave morality. Consider his frank assessment of democracy. With a few exceptions, democracy has not brought good government to developing countries. What Asians value may not necessarily be what Americans or Europeans value. This was not merely a rejection of specific policies, but a rejection of the entire moral framework that justified Western criticism of Singapore. Western human rights discourse, in Lee's view, was a form of slave morality. It elevated abstract rights over concrete results. It celebrated weakness, victims, and demonized strength, oppressors, and it provided a vocabulary for the less successful to constrain the more successful. I am not interested in ratings by Freedom House or whatever, Lee declared. The acid test of any legal system is not the greatness or the grandeur of its ideal concepts, but whether, in fact, it is able to produce order and justice. Lee's Machiavellian streak, between being loved and being feared, I have always believed Machiavelli was right, was another expression of master morality. The statesman must be willing to do what is necessary, regardless of how it appears to moral spectators. Because my posture has been such that nobody doubts that if you take me on, I will put on knuckle dusters and catch you in a cul-de-sac. There is no other way you can govern a Chinese society. Nietzsche would have recognized this immediately. He wrote of the Renaissance prince who had to be both lion and fox. Lee was Singapore's prince, not in the hereditary sense, though his son would become prime minister, but in the sense of being the one who took responsibility for the foundation and preservation of the state. If nobody is afraid of me, Lee said, I'm meaningless. Yet Lee's master morality was not pure domination. Like Nietzsche's idealized aristocrats, he felt obligations to those he led, not obligations of equality, but obligations of care. A nation is great not by its size alone. It is the will, the cohesion, the stamina, the discipline of its people, and the quality of their leaders which ensure it an honorable place in history. The good ruler was not the one who satisfied the people's desires, but the one who shaped their desires toward worthy ends. Amor fati, love of fate, was Nietzsche's formula for greatness. That one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely to bear what is necessary, still less to conceal it, but to love it. This is not passive acceptance of circumstance, but active affirmation of one's entire life, including its suffering, its failures, its apparent accidents. Singapore's fate was brutal. A tropical island at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, strategically located but utterly dependent on its neighbors for water, food, and markets. A population of recent immigrants from China, India, and the Malay world, with no common language, no common religion, no common history. A colonial legacy of racial segregation and economic exploitation, a geographic position that made it a pawn in great power competition. Lee Kuan Yew loved this fate, not in spite of its cruelty, but through it. Where others saw a city condemned to failure, Lee saw an opportunity. Where others saw weakness, he saw the motivation for strength. Where others saw a lack of natural resources, he saw the necessity of creating human resources. The 3.5 years of Japanese occupation, Lee wrote, were the most important of my life. They gave me vivid insights into the behavior of human beings and human societies. The young Lee had watched British colonial superiority crumble in weeks. He had seen the arbitrary brutality of the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police. He had worked in their propaganda office, learning how power really operates. He had narrowly escaped the Sook Ching massacre that claimed tens of thousands of Chinese lives. A lesser man might have emerged broken, traumatized, resentful. Lee emerged tempered. He had seen the worst of human nature, the collaboration of opportunists, the cruelty of conquerors, the helplessness of the weak, and he had decided to ensure that his people would never again be victims. This is amor fati in its political dimension, not merely accepting one's history, but using it as fuel for future greatness. Consider how Lee transformed Singapore's apparent liabilities into assets. No natural resources? Then become a hub for processing others' resources? No hinterland? Then become indispensable to the hinterlands of others. A small population? Then maintain the highest quality standards. Vulnerable to external pressure? Then make yourself so useful that no one can afford to destroy you. Nietzsche wrote that only great pain is the ultimate liberator of the spirit. Singapore's pain, its vulnerability, its near-death experience of 1965, liberated it from the illusions that afflicted more comfortable nations. Singaporeans could not pretend that the world was fair or that good intentions guaranteed good outcomes. They had to be better because they had no margin for error. Nietzsche's Übermensch, the overman or Superman, is perhaps his most misunderstood concept. It is not a biological category, despite what the Nazis claimed, but a spiritual one. The Übermensch is the human being who has overcome the inherited values of the herd, who creates new values out of their own authentic existence, who says yes to life in all its tragedy and joy. Was Lee Kuan Yew an Übermensch? The question is provocative, but let us take it seriously. Consider the arc of his life. Born to privilege in colonial Singapore, educated in British ways, fluent in English before Chinese, he might have become another successful lawyer, another comfortable member of the colonial elite. Instead, he chose the path of revolutionary politics. At Cambridge, Lee encountered the ideas of Harold Lasky and the Fabian socialists, though he studied law at Cambridge proper rather than at the London School of Economics where Lasky taught. Like many colonial students, he absorbed their critique of imperialism and their dreams of a more just society. But Lee was never a true believer. Lasky's Marxist socialist theories had a profound influence on many colonial students, he later wrote, quite a few of whom were to achieve power and run their underdeveloped economies aground by ineptly implementing policies based on what they thought Lasky taught. It was my good fortune that I had several of these failed economies to warn me. Here we see the Nietzschean moment, the refusal to be captured by any ideology, the insistence on judging ideas by their results rather than their intentions, the willingness to abandon beliefs that proved false. Lee's famous pragmatism was not intellectual laziness, but perpetual self-overcoming. He would try socialism, find it wanting, and discard it. He would try liberal democracy, find it unsuitable for Singapore's circumstances, and modify it. He would try various economic models and select what worked. Nietzsche wrote that man is something that shall be overcome. Lee overcame himself repeatedly. He overcame his colonial education to lead an anti-colonial movement. He overcame his socialist inclinations to embrace capitalism. He overcame his Chinese identity to build a multiracial nation. He overcame his personal grief at Singapore's separation from Malaysia to make independence work. When asked whom he admired among world leaders, Lee's answer was revealing. I would say the greatest was Deng Xiaoping, at his age, to admit that he was wrong, that all these ideas, Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, they are just not working and have to be abandoned. You need a great man to do that. This is precisely the quality Nietzsche celebrated: the courage to overcome one's past commitments when they prove inadequate. Both Lee and Deng demonstrated that the truly strong are not those who cling to failed beliefs, but those who can slough them off like a snake shedding its skin. Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal recurrence poses the ultimate test of life affirmation. What if a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, "This life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh must return to you"? Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? We cannot know Lee's private thoughts, but his public statements suggest a man at peace with his life, a man who would embrace the eternal recurrence. At the end of the day, he wrote, "What I cherish most are the human relationships. With the unfailing support of my wife and partner, I have lived my life to the fullest. It is the friendships I made and the close family ties I nurtured that have provided me with that sense of satisfaction at a life well lived." Yet Lee's life was not without suffering. The separation from Malaysia brought him to tears. The constant struggle against communists, against racial chauvinists, against international critics, against the entropy that threatens every political order, these took their toll. His wife's illness and death in 2010 devastated him. "Without her," he said, "I would be a different man with a different life." But this is precisely what eternal recurrence demands. Not a life without suffering, but a life whose suffering is redeemed by its achievements. Lee would have to live again the sleepless nights of 1965, the betrayals and disappointments, the hard choices that earned him enemies. He would also live again the triumph of transformation, the pride of watching Singapore become what no one thought possible, the respect of world leaders who sought his counsel. "Even from my sickbed," Lee declared in 1988, "even if you are going to lower me into the grave and I feel something is going wrong, I will get up." This is not the statement of a man who regrets his choices. This is amor fati expressed in the language of a fighter who never stops fighting. If offered the choice to live his life again, one suspects Lee would ask only, "When do we begin?" Nietzsche's concept of pathos of distance describes the psychological separation that enables the noble type to create values rather than merely accept them. The aristocrat does not look to the crowd for validation. He looks down at the crowd from a height that permits clarity of vision. This distance is not contempt or not merely contempt, but the space required for genuine creation. Lee Kuan Yew maintained this distance throughout his career. He was never a populist. He never pretended to be a common man. He did not disguise his intelligence or his education or his conviction that most people were not qualified to make complex policy decisions. So when people say, "Oh, ask the people," it's childish rubbish. We are leaders. We know the consequences. This stance made Lee profoundly unfashionable in an age of democratic sentiment. Politicians in the West learned to perform humility, to claim they were merely servants of the people, to defer ostentatiously to public opinion. Lee refused this charade. "I ignore polling as a method of government," he declared. "I think that shows a certain weakness of mind, an inability to chart a course whichever way the wind blows." Yet Lee's distance was not detachment. He studied his people obsessively. He walked the ground, visited housing estates, reviewed feedback reports. He knew more about Singapore than any pollster could tell him. His distance was intellectual and moral, not informational. He stood apart, not because he did not understand the people, but because understanding them did not mean deferring to them. Nietzsche wrote that every elevation of the type man has hitherto been the work of an aristocratic society, and so it will always be. Lee might have agreed, though he would have defined aristocracy differently. Not birth, not wealth, but proven capacity. Singapore's meritocracy was an attempt to create an aristocracy of achievement, a ruling class that earned its position through performance rather than inheritance. The pathos of distance also shaped Lee's foreign policy. He refused to be bullied by larger nations. He refused to join fashionable international causes that did not serve Singapore's interests. He told Americans uncomfortable truths about their society. He told the British uncomfortable truths about their decline. He told Australians uncomfortable truths about their neighborhood. His frankness was another form of aristocratic privilege, the freedom to speak without regard for approval. Ladies and gentlemen, what have we learned from this strange dialogue between a German philosopher and a Singaporean statesman? First, that the creation of values is the highest human achievement and the most dangerous. Lee Kuan Yew, like Nietzsche's ideal philosopher, took responsibility for meaning-making in a world where inherited meanings had collapsed. He did not merely inherit Singapore, he invented it. The nation we know today, orderly, prosperous, multiracial, disciplined, was not a natural evolution, but a willed creation. It could have been otherwise. It might yet become otherwise. Nothing in politics is permanent. Second, that the will to power, properly understood, is not a vice, but the precondition of all virtue. Lee's relentless drive to strengthen Singapore was not megalomania, but survival instinct elevated to policy. A weak nation cannot be moral. It can only be prey. The capacity to impose one's will on circumstances, to refuse victimhood, to demand excellence, to accept nothing less than success, is what separates those who shape history from those who are shaped by it. Third, that amor fati, the love of one's fate, is not resignation, but the highest form of engagement. Lee did not wish Singapore had been dealt different cards. He played the cards he was dealt with such skill that his hand became legendary. The constraints that might have destroyed a lesser leader became the forge in which Singapore's distinctive strengths were tempered. Fourth, that the pathos of distance, the willingness to stand apart from the herd, to resist the pull of consensus, to maintain intellectual and moral independence, is essential to genuine leadership. Democracy may be the least bad form of government, but it is not a substitute for judgment. The leader who merely follows public opinion is no leader at all. And fifth, that the question of the Übermensch remains open. Nietzsche called for a new type of human being, one who could bear the burden of creating values in a godless universe, who could say yes to life in all its tragedy, who could be both destroyer and creator. Lee Kuan Yew was not this figure in full. He was too pragmatic, too focused on his small island, too uninterested in philosophy for its own sake. But he embodied key aspects of the Nietzschean ideal more fully than most politicians of his era. What remains? Singapore endures, but Lee worried about complacency. When things always become better, he warned, people tend to want more for less work. The discipline forged by survival may soften in prosperity. The values Lee created may be consumed rather than renewed by his successors. Every achievement carries the seeds of its own decadence. Nietzsche knew this. He watched 19th century Europe exhaust its spiritual capital. He foresaw the nihilism that would afflict the 20th century. He called for creators who could build new values from the ruins, knowing that their creations too would eventually crumble. Lee knew this too. In his final years, he played the same record again and again to young Singaporeans who thought they had heard it all before. Success is not a permanent condition. History does not end. The struggle continues. Perhaps this is the deepest lesson of reading Lee through Nietzsche, that all human achievement is precarious, that every summit reveals new valleys, that the work of creation is never finished. The will to Singapore, to any great project, is not a thing accomplished, but a process continued. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche wrote, "And may the value of all things be fixed anew by you." This was Lee Kuan Yew's achievement in miniature, to fix anew the value of a tiny island that the world had written off. The question for his successors, and for us, is whether we have the courage to do the same in our own domains. The music of these two lives, the German philosopher who never left Europe, the Singaporean statesman who transformed Asia, harmonizes in ways neither could have anticipated. They form an unfinished symphony, a work that demands continuation. Here's to those who will carry the melody forward.